Let's start. Okay.
This is Jamie Kirk interviewing Lutz Drescher at 8 o'clock in the evening on Monday, June 6th, 2016. The interview is taking place in the meeting room of Yim's House Hotel at Waryeongdong, Jongno-gu, Seoul, Korea. The video operator or video camera operator is Kim Tae-hee. Your oral history interview will be used for the second oral history project for foreign activists related to the Korean democracy movement being conducted by KDF. Lutz, when was the last time you visited Korea, and what brought you here then?
Since I've been working for the last 15 years as East Asia Liaison Secretary of the Evangelical Mission in Solidarity in Germany, in Stuttgart, I used to come every year to Korea, and in fact last year I came twice. I visited South Korea in September, and the occasion was General Assembly of PROK and PCK, which are two member churches of EMS, and I brought along our General Secretary. I had interviews, press conference with NCCK because of our involvement in reunification questions. So I was here in September for about 12 days. We had a peace and reunification conference and something else. And then I visited North Korea in end of October of last year. So I was in Korea twice last year. And before, the years before, I at least was every year once in South Korea.
I see. Were your visits last year typical of your previous visits, or were they different from previous visits?
Yeah, I mean, when I didn't attend every time General Assembly meetings. Attending General Assembly gives you the chance to meet many people, but the disadvantage is usually I like to be at the places where things are happening. For example, I visited Gangjeon village, or I'm at local congregations, or I visit. Before last year, I visited the Conscious Objectors organization, working for the rights of people not to go to the military. So when I visit the General Assembly, I'm much more bound to official church structures, while on normal visits I'm relating to the churches and I'm relating to civil society in Korea in a way.
Okay. I'd heard a little bit about your personal history. Can you please tell me when and where you were born, and maybe tell me a little bit about your youth and school life?
Yeah, I was born in 1953 in southern Germany. My father was a forestry commissioner, so I grew up in a beautiful rural area called Black Forest in Germany, a tourist area. And my family from my mother's side, they have been pastors since the time of Reformation. So I've been very much involved in churches all my life long. My interest in worldwide relation, globalization, ecumene, if you say, ecumenical movement started very early after I finished school. I went to India when I was 18 years old. And there I found out that the world is much wider than we thought. And at that time I often asked myself, what would my expectations be if I were born as an Indian? and it changed my perspective on myself, on the world, on our own country. And later I started to study religious education and social work, and then was working in a local congregation for 5 years. And then I was called to ask whether I'm ready to come to Korea. And when I was asked to come to Korea, I didn't hesitate long. I said yes. Also, I didn't have high expectation. I was rather a little bit afraid of coming here because I already knew too much about the situation in Korea, about dictatorship, and I knew Korea is close to Siberia, and Siberia has a very bad name in Germany. So I was not eager to come here in the beginning, but interested to come here.
Were there other places you wanted to go?
I was often in India. After my first visit to India, I went several times to India. I stayed once for a couple of weeks with Mother Teresa, where I learned a lot, where I learned the dignity of the poor, the value of poor people, that it's not a question of only of helping poor people, but of learning from them and of getting changed by the encounter with poor people in our own attitudes. This was a very important preparation for coming to Korea. It again changed my worldview, my faith and my perspectives. And I was asked by the Church of South India whether I would be ready to work with the Church of India. And that was, and so I was ready to do that. But because of the policy of the Indian government, foreigners are not allowed to work, pastors or church-related people are not allowed to work in India, so it was not possible. But my first meeting with the EMS was because of India. That was how I got to know them, inquiring whether it would be possible to work in India. And then when they were looking for somebody ready to serve in Korea, so they already somehow knew that I'm existing somewhere on the horizon, and so I think they asked me.
So it was kind of like fate.
Yeah.
Aside from your upbringing with your parents or your family being in religious leadership roles and your experience meeting Mother Teresa, were there any other formative events or influences that led you down this path?
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing, what I said already, I'm very happy to be related to the wide world. I like to travel, and I like to really get to know and to understand people who are different, who are living in a different culture. I'm not assuming that we are all the same. I think there is a lot of value in the fact that we are different, and still we can understand and respect each other and learn from each other. And we can learn from each other because we are different from each other. These were basic values. And regarding the Korean situation, another influence that was very strong in my life, I'm born, as I told you, in 1953, so I was very much influenced by the student movement in Germany in 1968. I was a high school student, but I was already at the time, I was very aware of political dynamics, and I was heavily involved in the first ever strike of school students in 1971 or something like that. I was one of the leaders of that strike, resisting against the policy of of the regional government. So I had a high interest in politics, and I had a high interest in the history of the confessing church in Germany. As you know, in Germany during the Nazi Schiede, during the under fascism, parts of the German churches were in resistance, calling themselves confessing church, being aware of that God is more important than rulers are, and even ready, at least Dietrich Bonhoeffer, ready to actively resist the unjust and the inhuman rule of Adolf Hitler. And I did, as a student, already in high school and later during my studies of religious education, I very intensively studied and read the history of the confessing church, and that was one of the points which fascinated me most regarding the Korean situation.
Interesting.
Really interesting.
It was. Excuse me. Why?
Can I get some water?
Why did you readily accept the invitation to the 2016 International Democracy Solidarity Seminar, which has been organized by the KDF?
Many of my friends and many of my sonbe, of my predecessors, they have been invited to be part of the Korea Democracy Foundation yearly seminars. I think it's taking place yearly, and I think I've been invited because people in responsibility they are aware of that I retired end of April, though I wouldn't easily have been able to come if I would have been still in my official position. But since now I'm free, yo-yo, in Korean you say you have space. It was a precious opportunity to relate again. I know many of the people involved in KDF, so I'm looking forward to meeting them, and I think the history of democratization in South Korea is one of the stories of hope of the last century. It's a very, very powerful story of hope that a person who has been sentenced to death, namely Kim Dae-jung, who has been in prison, who has been in exile, who has been under house arrest, that a person like him became president. That's a totally turn of history, and it's a history of which is giving hope to future generations. And I think in this respect, Korea Democracy Foundation is doing a very important job, and you are part of this endeavor because we have to remember the stories of hope of the past in order to give shape to the future. And so I think since I like to share stories of hope, I came.
I see. How were you first then engaged with the democracy movement of South Korea?
I said it's a very funny story in a way, because even before I've been called to come to Korea, I was in a way involved. There was when I started to study in 1975. We had a kind of once a month, we were praying for other countries where people were living in difficulties. There were several countries where there were war and famine, and one of the countries we once prayed for was Korea, and I think it was after the Myeongdong incident in 1976 when Kim Dae-jung and when Yushin, at Yushin time, when Park Chung-hee wanted to renew his presidency and people resisted, and then they were put into prison. At that time we held a prayer meeting for remembering the people imprisoned in South Korea. And I very well remember there was a young Korean who shared with us his stories, but he didn't come to this prayer meeting because he was so afraid from the Korean CIA that he didn't want to appear openly. That was for me showing how severe the restrictions on the Korean Peninsula are and how difficult the situation for people engaged in human rights movement is. That was my first encounter, what was sometimes a random encounter. And then in 1981 I started my professional life as a catechist and youth worker and social worker in one of the local congregations. And at that time the German churches, the Church of Baden, had invited a ecumenical co-worker from Korea whose name is Kim Won-bae. He is from Mokpo. He was working in the Christian Academy, which in the 70s was one of the centers of the Korean democracy movement. And he came to Germany as ecumenical co-worker, and God willing somehow we ended up in one and the same local congregation, and we soon became friends. I'm going to visit him on this trip, and he shared a lot of his own experiences at the Christian Academy, and he showed us and our congregation this famous Gwangju video, the original videos which have been taken by a German journalist who was present in 1918 May in Gwangju. It were pictures which have been forbidden in Korea. They have not been shown in Korea itself, but we could see them in Germany. And this was a very, very shocking and eye-opening experience.
So you've seen Korea's transition to democracy firsthand. Do you, do you see that Korea needs to continue that effort?
I think now we are too fast. because I just ended up I only was in 81 now.
My mistake.
And you're already in the future. I'm too fast? It's okay?
My mistake.
No problem.
Well, you spoke about the video of the Gwangju People's Uprising. What was your reaction when you first saw that?
Yeah, I mean, I think all the people who saw these videos, they were really shocked about the brutality of the paratroopers, of the way people undiscriminatedly have been beaten, have been killed, and so I think one reaction was really being sad about what's happening in the world in other countries. Another reaction was prayer for the victims and for those engaged. And a very significant, for us, a very significant event was that with the help of Kim Won-bae, we came into contact with one of the activists in Gwangju itself. It was a woman called An Sung-ne. She later is founder of the May Mother's House. May is over the month of May Mother House. And she was, if I recall it right, she was a nurse. So she has seen in her hospital the wounded people, she has seen the dead people, and her husband was one of the leaders of the May 5th democracy movement in Guangzhou, and he was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment after 1980. And we came into contact with her, and she wrote us letters. And these letters were really moving letters, sharing with us her pain, but sharing with us as well the hope she was having, and they were having, for change on the Korean Peninsula. And for my life and for my theological thinking and for my thinking as an activist, a very important event was that one day she wrote us, we have renamed our local church into Kobek Joy, into Confessing Church. And then she wrote, Dietrich Bonhoeffer is alive in Korea. And so I knew what she wanted to tell us. But then we were a whole group of 20, 30 church members who were concerned about the situation in Korea. When they heard this, they say openly, they confessed, oh, we don't know much about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, we don't know much about the situation in Nazi Germany, because until in the 70s, 80s of last century, even in school, our own history has not been taught a lot. So a lot of ignorance was there still about the Nazi movement, in Nazi rule in Germany. So these people started to ask us, how could you help us to understand more? And then we had a series of 3 or 4 evenings where we were dealing with the history of fascism, the resistance of the church, the history of the confessing church, and focusing for one evening on the life and on the effects Dietrich Bonhoeffer had on church and theology, and this means we learned a lot from Korea by the struggle of the Korean people. Our struggle was enkindled, and that was, again, it was a time when in Germany there was a strong peace movement.